Hans Holbein the Younger came from a family of painters. His father was Hans Holbein the Elder. His brother was also a painter. I believe his father, so Hans Holbein the Younger's grandfather, was a painter. And his older brother Ambrose, was a painter. And Ambrose died about 1519, so he died much earlier than Hans Holbein. He is a German artist, and he was born in Augsburg, but he moved to Basel, and then eventually he moved to England. And so we're going to look at his career in both places. This is a self-portrait of him. Now, he's born in Augsburg, 1497. He moved to Basel by 1515. He did some trips outside, and he took a 2-year trip to England in 1526 to 28. He had a recommendation from Erasmus of Rotterdam, the humanist scholar, to Sir Thomas More. He had wonderful connections. And so he went to England, and he stayed with Thomas More, and we'll see some of the pictures from that time. I'll tell you a little more about his biography. Basel became a Protestant iconoclastic city. Now, this was not Lutheran doctrine. This was Zwingli and some of the other Protestants that are sometimes called the radical Protestants, because they go so much further than Martin Luther ever did. They were iconoclasts. They destroyed images of religious art. They thought that they were idolatry. And they said that the communion service was not the body and blood of Christ. It was simply a memorial. Now, imagine that you are an artist working in a town and the iconoclasts take over. And in fact, they did take over. And they did go in and destroy images, including undoubtedly some by Holbein. And they also insisted that everyone in the town subscribe to the faith as preached by Zwingli. And the chronic is recorded at first as saying, well, he wasn't going to swear to it, evidently, and he said, I need to have some more information about this before I do this. And then later on, he is listed as attending the churches as he, as essentially the law was saying that you should do. People sometimes wonder what Holbein's religion was, but I suspect that what he's doing is going along with what is the authorities at the time. However, if you're working in an iconoclastic city, it's going to be difficult for an artist to make a living. Large part of the art market was religious art. It's the largest part of the art market. And although Holbein might be able to get some other commissions, that part of the market is pretty much gone. So he goes back to England in 1432, trying to see if he can, excuse me, oh man, typo! He goes back to England in 1532. That's straight. He goes back to England in 1532, and although there are, some short trips back, he pretty much lives in England for the rest of his life. When he comes back, he's found that things have changed. We'll talk about this. This was the height of what they call the king's great matter, trying to divest himself of his wife, Catherine of Aragon. But Holbein came back to England, and as I said, the climate had changed, and his patrons then seemed to be the Boleyn family and Thomas Cromwell. And eventually he becomes the court painter to Henry VIII, and that's in 1536. Now, he starts to specialize in portraiture, and that is what he's known for. Holbein is known as one of the greatest portrait painters of all time. He's known for his detailed naturalism, and as you'll see also, his wonderful sense of design. He is the person who created the image of Henry VIII of England. When you think of an image of Henry VIII, there are other portraits of him, by other people. But the image you most likely have is one that was created by Holbein, even if it was copied by someone else. And they were copied by many people. So that image that we have of Henry is the Holbein portrait. So let's go back a little. Now we're back to works that he was creating in Basel. And he was creating, as we said, religious works. And this one is something that people have extremely strong emotional reaction to, Christ in the tomb. And as you can see, it's the right shape to be the predella of an altarpiece. When we have this close-up, I want you to notice the bruising around the wounds, and how, for example, the hand, you see this, gaping red wound, and then the hands are all bruised, and the fingers are somewhat contorted, knobby. It's, as I said, it's an image that people have very strong reactions to. It is detailed realism, and Christ looks like a corpse. Some people, are horrified by this. However, one of the things that it's really doing is establishing the reality of Christ's death. In other words, he wasn't just in, we'd say in a coma, and then recovered. He was dead, and he came back to life. And it also, of course, refers to the suffering of Christ. You can still see the marks of his suffering on his body. And you'll think about Grunewald, for example. Now, Grunewald did it with some exaggeration. And Holbein is doing it with rather brutal realism. But you certainly have this strong emotional reaction to the dead Christ displayed for our veneration, but also, this is the kind of thing, you should feel guilty. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. My sins, my guilt, my fault caused Christ's death. Is, of course, the reaction. And I wanted to show you some of these details of the hands, the feet. Very stark realism. He also designed woodcuts. And he did not cut these himself. They know who the cutter was. But he designed many different woodcuts. And what we're looking at now is a series that's either called The Dance of Death, because that's the traditional name, or it was also published under the title Pictures of Death. And they were woodcuts, and in a way they broke with, or expanded on, I should say, the tradition of showing the dance of death, which usually is, a skeleton who leads often a single figure, to their death, showing that death is no respecter of persons. You can be the richest person, you can be highly placed in the church hierarchy, you could be a child, and sometimes death even passes over people who are suffering and would want to die. That is not particularly in there, but what you're seeing are settings, and they are appropriate to the person. And you're seeing very lively images of death. And what's going on. Now, we're just going to see a few of these. I think you can go on the web and see the whole, all of the pictures. The series begins with Adam and Eve. And of course, they are the persons who bring sin and death into the world. And when they are expelled from Eden and they go out into the world, they will die. So what you're seeing is an expulsion of Adam and Eve with this wonderful foreshortened angel with the fiery sword driving Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. They're actually running. And who is there, at the perimeter is a skeleton, is death. Death personified as a skeleton, making music, as though he's accompanying them on their way to death. Now, they don't die the minute they get out. It's like, now you're in the world, it's present, and you will eventually die. Death is always with us, even as we live. The one that's illustrated in your textbook is Death and the Plowman. The peasant who works, hard all his life. And here is, plowing the ground to raise food. Death is here. It's rather interesting because death is not grabbing hold of the plowman. He seems to be forcing the horses onward. And as your text says, it's like he's helping him with his plowing. Is this the cause of his death? That, he's plowing his last row. He's going to die. And we see this, what wonderful vista as he's heading. He's facing back toward the horizon and the landscape. And on the horizon there are these rays of light from presumably the setting sun, the twilight of this man's life. So, it's in some ways it's a very sympathetic picture. There is also some discussion about whether this, the Dance of Death or the pictures of death, have Protestant point of view. They may have been used by both Catholics and Protestants alike, but there are a few images, particularly this one, that I should say are highly critical of the Pope, and those seem to have a Protestant point of view. I mean, as I said, both sides were very intolerant of each other. The Catholics thought that the Protestants were heretics and wholly evil. The Protestants thought that the Catholics, and particularly the church hierarchy and the Pope, were wholly evil. They talked about them as though they were the beast from, or the Antichrist is often used. Both sides saying, Luther is the Antichrist, no, the Pope is the Antichrist. So there was no love lost between the different sides. And then, of course, as these other Protestant groups grow up, there was intolerance between them, between, say, the Lutherans and the Anabaptists or something. It was, I would say, this is not a time I wanted to live. Very interesting to study, though. This is death and the Pope, and you have those skeletal images of death shown twice. Once he is sort of standing behind the Pope, who has, of course, all of his papal regalia. He's on a throne. He's beneath a baldachin or canopy, and the emperor is kneeling and kissing his feet. And he's crowning the emperor. So it seems a kind of coronation of an emperor. And showing his worldly superiority even to the princes of the earth. We also have all of the some different members of the church hierarchy. So we have a cardinal and a bishop, and looks like another bishop there. And behind the cardinal is another skeleton, or in this case, almost a kind of mummified figure. You can see the skeleton, but there's still some skin on the body, and then you have this little wiggly thing in the middle, which could be intestines, but it's probably worms eating the body of death. So, death is right there. There are actually two devils in this, one up in the upper left on the drapery looking down at the Pope, and another on the upper right flying in holding what looks like a placard with seals hanging from the bottom. What that undoubtedly is a indulgence. That's how they're portrayed in the images. When they are selling indulgences, they'll have this portrayed with the seals of the Pope on it. So it does seem to me that there probably are some Protestant sympathies in this picture. But, even the Catholics, of course, were quite aware that many of the Renaissance popes, and earlier popes as well, some of them had been quite corrupt. And there was a reform movement within the church, people who didn't want to leave the church but did want to clean up abuses. So I guess you can decide for yourself. The other one, which I suppose you would say is a little bit more ambiguous, is Death and the Nun. And here you have the nun at her cell with, it's a very nice cell. She's got draperies on her bed, and she's got a lovely little altar there. And, she hands her in prayer, and she's kneeling, but she's not looking at the altar. Her head is turned toward a young man, a musician playing the lute, who is seated on her bed. Now, nuns are cloistered. There is not supposed to be any man at all in your cell, in your bedroom, and definitely not a musician. Musicians playing lutes are often seen in things like gardens of love and suggesting voluptas or lust, things like that. So it's quite obvious that this young man is her lover, and of course nuns are brides of Christ. They are not supposed to be having sex with anybody. So there is certainly the idea that this is a corrupt nun. She has given way to lust, and she's going to be dying in her sin, because here we have the image of death, this skeletal figure, pinching out the candle, which is a kind of metaphor for death. He's pinching out the candle, at the candle of her life. And then in the foreground, in the lower left, you see overturned a hourglass. Her time has run out. Now, this is also something that could be seen as a Protestant attack on nuns. They're corrupt. However, before the Protestant Reformation, there were often references to certainly some friars and priests and nuns who were corrupt. It was known that not everybody who was clergy was a saint. And they were supposed to reform. So it certainly leads your mind very clearly to a Protestant criticism of nunneries. But it could also, have just the idea of the corrupt nun rather than all nuns behaving in this way. Now, we said that Erasmus of Rotterdam gave Holbein a reference to Thomas More. Erasmus of Rotterdam was portrayed by a number of people. Albrecht Dührer's engraving. There's a painting by Quentin Metzys. But more often he was portrayed by Hans Holbein, and he was living in Basel when the iconoclasts took hold. He did leave. He went to Freiburg. And so they knew each other, and he painted him. And Erasmus' favorite portraits of himself were by Holbein. And you can see why when you look at them. I love these portraits. What you see here is this scholar and a man of great dignity. And so here he is with his doctoral cap, in his doctoral robes, writing, working on his scholarship. He is in profile, and there is this detailed tapestry hanging behind him, which gives you some pattern. So does the outline of the faces. It's also very three-dimensional. If you look at the way he's foreshortened the hands, for example. Excuse me. So we see the scholar at work. We see dignity, calm. I think you can understand why Erasmus favored these portraits. And here is the detail of the hands, and here are the sketches that Holbein did for them. He carefully planned everything out, and I've obviously tried slightly different arrangement of the fingers. This is another one of his portraits. This in the traditional three-quarter view. It's more than a bust length. It's sort of half length, with the hands folded and they almost resting on the frame, not quite. And you can see his physiognomy. It's he's very recognizable. He has these high cheekbones and the prominent but noble nose and very strong jaw. And, it all works together, and the shapes of the face are kind of repeated in the shapes of the way the doctoral hat, which is a soft hat, and can take slightly different shapes, is played, or the arrangement of the garment. And so here you're seeing with plays of the browns and blacks and very deep grays, and then the background is this azure, almost a kind of turquoise, a little blue, more blue than green, but bluish green on the background that gives it some color. And once again, notice that he has such a wonderful sense of design, that the negative shapes, the background shapes, are also very interesting. This is very small, as you can see, only about 7 inches high, but pretty exquisite portrait. Now, we said Hans Holbein painted religious subjects, some of which, of course, were destroyed by the iconoclasts. But this one was saved, and he worked on portraits for this man as well. His name was Jacob Meyer, and he was one of Hans Holbein's chief patrons when he was living in Basel. Meyer was, your book says, a moneylender, a banker, we might say. And he was of the wealthy merchant class. He became wealthy, and he became the Burgermeister of Basel. And he is shown here, and he was a very devout Catholic. He's shown here with the picture of, it's often called the Madonna of Mercy. Now, she doesn't have her, she does. She has her cloak stretched out. You can just see it over the shoulder of Jacob Meyer. But, these are not little figures underneath the cloak, as we, often see with the Madonna of Mercy. If you think about Michael Earhart's version, and all the little townsmen. Here, the donors are, proper life size. And you have this, beautiful monumental Virgin Mary in the center. We have certainly Renaissance architectural motifs in the what are these, capitals, consuls that are flanking Mary. And then the shell motif is something that you see very frequently in Italian Renaissance art. And it's associated with classical art. And you'll notice how the shell, which sort of reminds us of maybe the apse of a church, although it's certainly not that, it's more decorative here, also forms a kind of halo around Mary and the Christ child. You might also notice how the Christ child's showing. He's a little baby, he's cuddling up to his mother, but he's also got this very lively pose, as though he's wiggling around. And then, and I've never seen a Christ child doing this actually, with his arms stretched out, foreshortened arm, foreshortened hand, toward the viewer, maybe a bit over some of the the protection perhaps over the patrons, but it's almost like he's reaching for us. And you might notice that the youngest child, the baby down below of the Meyer family, looks like a little Christ child, kind of Michelangelo-esque actually, for a baby. One of the other portraits that he paints shows his wife and children, and usually goes under the name of the artist's family. It could also be his wife and child. His wife, Elspeth, and his two oldest children are portrayed here. And it's quite emotive, quiet, but there is such a sense, and I try to articulate what you have here in the woman's face, and actually the little boy's face as well, and even the baby. The woman just looks weary. The child looks very apprehensive. Even the baby looks apprehensive. This was painted after Holbein returned to Basel from his first trip to England. So he was away for 2 years. And when he returns to England again, he leaves his family behind. And, when you look at this, you just think of, what happens. Now, I've read that he sent money back to his family. He kind of established another family in England. He had children there as well. Obviously, he couldn't legally marry another woman because he was still married. So maybe he did provide for his family, but he only saw them extremely rarely. So, we know what happens, that she will have to raise the family by herself. And I find it fascinating that he would show his wife in this way. Okay. First time he goes to England, he goes with references from Erasmus of Rotterdam to Thomas More. Now, Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More were both humanist scholars. Erasmus, that was his profession. Thomas More's profession was lawyer, but he was also a scholar. He is famous for writing Utopia. And you've probably heard the term utopia referred to, the ideal city, the ideal world. And that is the name that comes out of the name of Thomas More's book about this ideal city. He was a very able lawyer, and he became Chancellor of England, which is pretty much the highest secular office beneath the king. So, it'd be almost like being kind of like a prime minister, although in this case, the king has all the power. He's an absolute monarch, and you are administrative and doing presumably the king's will, administering the kingdom. So he rose about as high as you could in England without being from the royal family. And you'll see I also wrote that he was a saint. He is a canonized saint of the Catholic Church. He is a martyr. He was also a man of deep faith. And when Henry set aside his wife and set himself up as the head of the Church of England, More would not go along with that, and so he retired from office. But eventually, Henry insisted that everyone, swear that yes, he was the head of the church, and More refused, and he was executed. He was beheaded, and so he's considered to be a martyr for his very deep faith. One of the wonderful things about Holbein's portraits of aristocrats in England is that the preparatory drawings have been saved. They were actually collected by John Cheek, who was the tutor to Edward the Sixth, and the son of Henry VIII. And so we do have these, and as I say, they are marked with the name of who is portrayed. Now this one we have both the drawing that he would do from life, and remember when we talked about Hans Holbein, remember when we talked about Roger van der Weyden, and we were showing St. Luke drawing the Virgin. We said that the usual method of creating a portrait at the 15th century, and as you can see, extending into the 16th century, was not for the sitter to sit there for hours while the artist painted the finished painting, but was to sit while he did a drawing, and then he would take the drawing and create the painting from that. So here we have our preparatory drawing, and you can see how very close the portrait is to the man. You might notice the chain of office with the Tudor rose hanging as a pendant from it. The House of Tudor, the House of York was ruling England in the 15th century, and Henry VII, this is Henry VIII's father, came back with an army and defeated the last York king, who was Richard III. And he married the York princess, Elizabeth of York. And so you have the end of the War of the Roses with the white rose of York, their symbol, and the red the red rose of Lancaster. Henry VII was considered to be the heir of Lancaster, combined. So you have this rose within a rose. And that is known as the Tudor rose. Holbein created a portrait of the entire family of Thomas More. And the portrait itself, the painting itself, does not survive, but the drawing does. And as you can see here is the drawing with little inscriptions on it telling us who everybody is. And as you can see, More is in the center. His daughter, Margaret, was one of the most highly educated women in England, probably the most highly educated, because her father had her educated. So she was, women were not educated as much as men. In the royal family, of course, Catherine of Aragon was an educated woman and had her daughter, Mary Tudor, also educated. In fact, there is a actual book that she commissioned about how you should have a princess educated. So we're seeing the rise of, for a few aristocratic women, often the royal women, getting more education. And in the case of Margaret, probably better education than most men as well. But you can see here it's all laid out with Thomas in the center, showing you within the home, within the domestic interior. Everyone is arranged so you can see them. There's figures who are actually in some kind of movement, and it's a beautifully arranged portrait, a group portrait. We don't have the painting. It didn't survive. But there is a variant copy. This is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And this is a bit later, as you can see, 1592, by Roland Locke. And you have this copy with some variations in it of the family of Thomas More. So maybe this gives us some idea of the color that would have accompanied it. Now, we'd said that Holbein had returned to England in 1532. 1532 was the height, the culmination of the king's great matter, which was his desire to put aside his wife, Catherine of Aragon, to annul his marriage. A lot of people call it the divorce, but he wasn't interested in a divorce. He wanted, officially you couldn't get divorced, but he wanted an annulment. So call it a divorce, call it an annulment, whichever you want. But basically he wanted to get rid of his wife. Now, there's a whole lot of ironies. And Henry VIII had written a treatise against Luther, defending the papacy against Luther. And for that, he was given a title by the Pope. He was called the Defender of the Faith. And, it becomes quite ironic in light of later events. I suppose quite ironic that the Queen of England today still carries that title. They just, every title that's given to the former monarchs sort of is passed on to the future ones. Although he became a destroyer of the Catholic faith rather than a defender as times went on. I guess I have to give you some background into this. Catherine of Aragon was a model queen, actually. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, who united their two kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and then they drove the Moors out of Spain, so they united Spain into this, one united kingdom. And they were a very powerful kingdom. They married their children to different princes. Isabella was married to the King of Portugal. Joanna, Catherine's younger sister, was married to the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Fair, and her child, Charles, became Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the King of Spain. They had one son, Juan, the Prince of Spain, who married Margaret of Austria, the sister of Philip the Fair, or Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy. But unfortunately, Juan died after 1 year, and there were no children from that marriage. Catherine was married. Catherine was sent to England to marry the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, who was Arthur, Henry's older brother. And she married him, I think he was about 15 years old, so he was very young. She married him, and he died of illness, not very long after their marriage. So then they have this widowed princess on their hands, and what are they going to do with her? There was some talk about Henry VII marrying her herself. I don't know how serious that was. He was also looking for, his wife, Elizabeth of York, had died. He was also seeing about possibly marrying Margaret of Austria. She did not. She married Philip of Savoy instead. And then later, as a widow, went on to be the regent of the Netherlands. So, what are you going to do with Catherine? Well, evidently, from descriptions and also from what are believed to be portraits of her by the wonderful artist from Estonia with a Netherlandish training, Michael Sittow. Catherine of Aragon, as a young woman, was, very cute, attractive, lovely lady. Wonderful manners, intellectual status. She was, as we hear later, almost a perfect queen. And after Henry died, Henry VII died, Henry VIII was eager to marry her. And she said that the marriage was not consummated, in which case it was not a valid marriage, and that would leave her free to marry the new heir to the throne and the new king, Henry VIII, and he was very eager to do so, at least at some points. People discuss this a bit. They had a long marriage, and she gave birth. I'm not sure how many children she gave birth to. Most of her children, including all the males, died either they were stillborn or they died very, very young, as infants within a few weeks of the birth, except for one, her daughter, Mary Tudor. Now, kings, particularly kings of England, want to have male heirs. They believe in the inferiority of women and don't think they should be ruling kingdoms, if at all possible. And so Henry was determined to have a male heir. Well, what could he do? His wife was getting older. She probably could not have any more children. He blamed her for having only a daughter. I've often wondered if history would have been changed if people had known about genetics and had realized that it is, the male who passes on what we call them the X and Y chromosomes that determine whether a child is male or female, and the women don't have anything to do with it. Actually, I suspect if that had been known in Henry VIII's time, he would have imprisoned and executed the scientists who dared say such a thing, that it was his failure. At any rate, he then started to say, "Oh, my conscience is bothering me." Actually, of course, he was totally unfaithful to Catherine. As I said, she was considered to be this excellent queen. She was beloved by the people. And he wanted to have the marriage annulled and then marry a younger woman. At this time, the woman was Anne Boleyn. And here's the irony. He's saying, "Oh, my conscience is bothering me because I've married my brother's widow." The woman he wanted to marry was the sister of his mistress, Mary Boleyn. So the exact same relationship, the exact same sort of incestuous ties would have applied. So nobody ever seems to mention that, but it was so. In fact, although we don't know for certain, Mary Boleyn was married to a man named Carey, and she had a son who was named Harry Carey, and it was suspected that he might be Henry's illegitimate son rather than her own husband's, although they didn't do DNA tests at those days. So Henry wants this young wife and thinks she will bear him a living son and heir. And he asks the Pope for an annulment, and the Pope refuses. Probably on religious grounds, but also on political ones, because in 1527, the sack of Rome had occurred. The Pope was imprisoned by Charles V, Catherine's nephew. So probably was not going to grant this annulment. So Henry came up with another idea. He would say that he was the head of the Church of England, and he split from the Pope and from the Roman Church, and then, his tribunals could annul the marriage. And of course, that is what happened. At first, he didn't split so much from many of the doctrines, such as the question of transubstantiation and things like this. Later on, though, quite soon, he realized, he had a lavish lifestyle, and that he could get money by closing down the monasteries and the convents and taking their wealth. And he could distribute it to people, who favored him. He could, make influential friends, and also use it for his own. So he then ended up destroying, they call it the despoiling of the monasteries. Okay. So this is the situation when Holbein comes to England. And it's probably not politic anymore to be the favorite of painter of Thomas More, because Thomas More is in disfavor. He's siding with the Queen. So he has other patrons, and in fact, the Boleyn family is his patron, and then Thomas Cromwell, who is the new chancellor. And they are the Protestant camp. It does seem odd that he does not have, that there are no portraits by Holbein of Anne Boleyn, but it's also possible that such things were destroyed or not in favor after she was executed. So he's in England, and he's taking commissions, but he's not yet the king's painter. But he is painting for many people associated with the court. And this very large painting, you might consider this one his masterwork, if you will. Not to get his mastership, that he had gotten long before, but this wonderful painting, known either as the Ambassadors or the French Ambassadors from 1533. It's a double portrait, two people, full-length portraits. And then you have, of course, this drapery behind them, brocade, and a kind of a double-level table between them, with all sorts of objects, this very elaborate still life on them. And there have been a number of interpretations of what these mean. It has been suggested that this is showing how erudite the two ambassadors were, that they're very intellectual and they know about such things as cosmology and geography and of course music. You can see the lute down here. Just showing them as learned men. The other idea is that these may have further symbolic meaning. The task of a diplomat is to try to establish harmony between these countries, which often have different interests. And that some of the objects here may refer to that idea of harmony. They may also refer to disharmony, to the split in the church. And how are we going to reconcile that? And so we're going to look at some of these a little bit closer. One of the things I want to point out is if you look up in the upper left, you will see, and I'll show you a detail, a crucifix. We've blown it up there so you can see it a little better. And it's half hidden behind the drapery. Now, both of these men were Catholic. And as we'll hear, one of them was actually, trying to work for a reconciliation between the Lutherans and the Catholics. So you have what? This reference to religion, to the idea that, Christ is always present, even if you're not really seeing him? Or is it that he's been covered up because of the disharmony between, within the churches? You could probably interpret that a number of ways, but it certainly does, suggest the presence of Christ and a religious idea. Who are these two men? We said they were the French ambassadors. They are both Frenchmen. Jean de Dinteville was the ambassador from France to England, and Georges de Sèvres was the French ambassador to the papal court. And he stopped over in England to visit his friend and had this portrait painted. Now, what are these objects? There is a celestial globe, a globe of the heavens. You can see some of the constellations drawn in here. And then you have various instruments of measurement. Things to measure time, to measure the heavens. On the lower shelf, you have a terrestrial globe, a globe of the earth. And you also have a compass, some other instruments of measurement, and two books. One which is open, and you can read what it is. It is Luther's hymn, "Come, Holy Spirit, our souls inspire." So it's a Lutheran hymnal with these two Catholic men, which is kind of interesting. And then there's a lute. And people suggest, well, the lute is showing that he wishes to establish harmony between the divided church. But there is a string, I don't think we can make it out very easily here, but there is a string that is broken. And it's kind of curving up. You can see a little bit against that green background of the brocade. And that broken string suggests that the harmony has been broken by religious discord. Now, there is another object in the foreground. And some of you may have figured out what it is, and others may be saying, what is that? Is it a shield? What is it? It is an anamorphosis, which is a distorted image. It's stretched out, and you're looking at it straight on, and it doesn't look right. But when you view it in a particular way, the image corrects itself. And this one, if you could go to the edge and look at it, you would see it corrected. And this is what you would see. You would see a skull. So it's essentially a flattened, distorted skull, stretched out. But if you look at it right from the side, you can tell what it is. This makes the image a Vanitas image. So here, they're talking about both worldly and religious things, perhaps within the context of the possible symbolism. But they're also reminded of death. Every human being will die. And so this makes it into a Vanitas image. You have all of these instruments of learning and music and various things, and you can't take it with you. when you die, all your learning is gone. All your attempts at harmony. So this is a kind of memento mori, remember death. Remember, man, that thou art dust, and to dust they shall return. So it certainly does have a rich, probably a rich symbolic meaning, and certainly the skull suggests that there is more to this than just realistic images that show their erudition. Although that certainly could be one of the ways you could interpret it. Now, I thought you might want to see another one of these. This is the portrait of Edward VI, Henry's heir and the next king of England. Only when we look at it in the front, it's all stretched out. And this is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And they have it, as you can see, in this little box. So you look at it from the front and you see this stretched out image. And then you go along to the side and they've got a little hole, a little lens. You're supposed to look into it. And it corrects itself, and you can see that on the side, how if you look at it from the edge, it corrects itself. And this is when Edward is 9 years old, as you can see. For 1546. They were popular, and they showed, how skillful the artist was, how he was skilled at mathematics and some geometry to be able to do this. Aren't we clever that we figured it out? All of those kind of feelings. But it was certainly fashionable. I want to talk to you about Holbein's images of Henry VIII. And I said that Holbein established the way we think of Henry VIII. In fact, I didn't see the exhibition, but one time when I was in England, I did buy an exhibition catalog of an exhibition of images of Henry VIII. And in the catalog, of course, they were referring to the British, but they said, when we think of king, we think of Holbein's images of Henry VIII. So an image that still has, repercussions today. He fashioned, today I guess what we call it spin or public relations or something like that, but he fashioned the image. And the painting in which this was established and then was copied and variants and things were made after it by Holbein and others was the Whitehall portrait of Henry VIII. Whitehall was one of the palaces in London, and this was fresco on the wall, I believe. I'm not sure. Let's just say it was in Whitehall. And it was created in 1537. 1536, Holbein becomes the court painter to Henry VIII. Incidentally, he was not paid the highest of Henry's painters. The miniaturists, we would always think of these large paintings as being, more important than miniatures, but actually the miniaturists were paid more than Holbein. Lucas Hornbout and Lavinia Beining-Turlick were both paid more than Holbein. He was made, I think it was £30 a year. I mean, it wasn't a pittance by any means, but it's just kind of interesting. At any rate, he painted this very famous portrait, and it's a dynastic portrait of Henry VII. His wife, Elizabeth, we'll show you in the image, you can see this. Unfortunately, the painting, along with Whitehall Palace, was burnt during the Great Fire of London. But we do have part of the cartoon. By the cartoon, we mean the full-scale preparatory drawing that was used to create the image. And here you see it. And you can see Henry VII, the father, the founder of the Tudor line, and then his son, Henry VIII, here. And you can see this very famous stance. His legs are far apart. He's got his hand on his hip. A very powerful pose. You might notice that the face is a kind of three-quarter view. When he painted it, he changed that, and he made Henry full face, looking directly out at the viewer. It really intensified the power of the image. Now, He said it was destroyed. And this is a copy that was made. So this becomes the archetype of images of Henry VII. This copy was made in the 17th century, but it wouldn't have the Holbein's pristine style, but it does show the arrangement of the forms. And as I said, it's a dynastic picture. You have sort of stepped up on a step. You have Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York, where they unite the houses of Lancaster and York by this forced marriage, this dynastic marriage. And then you have Henry VII heir, his son, who becomes Henry VIII of England, and his favorite wife, Jane Seymour. Now, you may know a little bit about Henry VIII and his wives. He doesn't seem to have treated his wives very fairly. That's one way of saying it. But Jane, who was his third wife, died from the after effects of childbirth, but she left him with his only male heir, Edward VI. And so she died soon enough that he didn't tire of her, and she also did what he wanted from a wife, which was to give him a male heir, a son. So she was favored in this dynastic picture. Now, as you can see, from the cartoon, he changed the face. He made a full face figure in the mural. And just here are some of those copies, probably by Holbein, the miniature of Henry. And then, many artists copied the image of Henry VIII with different backgrounds. They copied straight from the Whitehall mural. And these are pictures that we know today. Look at some of the copies here. All these different backgrounds. But, the same image over and over. Now, Holbein's portraits of the king define his image. And what he wants you to see is power, probably power and majesty. And I always say when I look at this, I say, well, this is not somebody you mess with. Of course, I know what he did to people who stood in his way in any way. He had them eliminated. But if you look at, you have this sort of favorite pose where Henry has his hand on his hip. And, of course, we know that in the Whitehall, it was a full length, so you had the legs apart. He's standing there, stalwart, firm, powerful. Incidentally, this pose was used by his heirs as well. Edward VI has a picture of himself, this young, slender teenager, essentially, in the same pose as his father. And his daughter Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, has herself portrayed with her hand on her hip. You can't see her legs, of course. She's a woman and she has long skirts. But with this same portrait, and she often say, "I have the stomach of a man. I may be a woman, but I can rule just as well as my father." A kind of idea that was passed on, and it was passed on in images, as well as actions and decrees and things like that. Holbein is known for his intense naturalism, realism. These are believed to look just like the people he's portrayed. He also shows the naturalistic detail in his beautiful portrayal of stuffs, of fabrics, of jewelry, of the clothing. And as you can see, this very complex clothing that he's wearing. The garment has these little puffs coming out. What that is, it's kind of this chemise or undergarment that people would wear, and these are slashed in the Spanish style, as I called it, and little tufts of that are pulled out through it. And then, as you can see, it's richly embroidered. We'll see some details in a minute. And of course, he has all of the richest fabrics, the fur, the golden chain. He doesn't need a crown and scepter to let you know he is the king. You also can see this, you can see it as, it's three-dimensional, solid, but you can also imagine it as flat and decorative. And once again, he has very interesting negative shapes, the surrounding shape of the background, as well as the positive shape of the figure. And here are some of the details, and you can see, you see the stitches. This is sort of the legacy that goes back to Jan van Eyck of showing precise naturalistic detail. The texture of the jewels, of the gold that has been wrought here, of brocades, of embroidery, the richness of the clothing. As we say, we don't have a Holbein portrait of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn lost Henry's favor when she gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. And I guess Henry's eye started to wander a bit, like usual, and more than his eye, undoubtedly. And then there was, he was in a joust, and, there was this, they reported to the Queen, and I think she thought that he had been killed. And the shock of it was supposed to have brought on a miscarriage of a boy child. And at that point, Henry wanted nothing more to do with her. And they trumped up these horrible charges against her, claiming that she had been unfaithful, which she may have had sex before she was married. We don't know. People theorize. But we're quite sure that she was very aware of her duty as being faithful to the king after she was married. But they trumped up all these charges, including incest with her brother, which, nobody believes these things, and had her executed because if a queen was unfaithful, or a woman was unfaithful to her husband, it was considered to be petty treason. If you were the queen and your husband was the king, it was not petty treason, it was treason, and she was executed. Her daughter was about 3 years old at the time. And immediately he married Jane Seymour. And here we see the portrait of Jane Seymour by Holbein. If Holbein did one of Anne, it has been lost, although I think there may be a miniature that some people think might be her, but not certain. Jane did exactly what Henry wanted her to do. She gave him a child, and then she promptly died. I'm sure he would have liked her to live and give him more male heirs, but she gave him his only male heir. And so she's the one who would appear in the dynastic portraits. And here we see the details. He shows her. We would not say that she was a terribly attractive woman, but at that time I think he was probably tired of the vivacious Anne Boleyn, and maybe interested in someone who was a little quieter. And so you see the emphasis, of course, once again, on the garment, on the jewels. Well, Jane is dead. Henry needs a new bride. It's nice to have one male heir, but as they always say, you need an heir and a spare, because something could happen. As Henry's older brother, Arthur, died. And, they do know that, princes die. So you need it to secure the line. You do need to have more male heirs. And so at this point, rather than pick one of the ladies of the court, which is what he'd always done, well, I shouldn't say always, he had done the last 2 times. He'd had a Spanish princess and then 2 English ladies. Thomas Cromwell, the chancellor, and Henry's advisors suggested that he should look around for a marriage with one of the royal ladies from another country, which would then strengthen England's position with the in the international community. He needed allies. So Holbein was sent around to different courts to paint prospective brides for Henry. You'll remember that Jan van Eyck, same thing. He was sent down to Portugal with the ambassadors arranging the marriage of the Duke of Burgundy to Elizabeth of Portugal. So Henry was sent to different courts to paint prospective brides. And this beautiful young woman was the Duchess of Milan. She was a widow, so she had a little more power about whether she was going to marry or not, I guess. And she was the daughter of Christian II of Denmark, the King of Denmark, the ruler of Denmark, who was a Protestant. So this would be an alliance with perhaps some Protestant. But she was also the niece of the Emperor Charles V, who was Catholic. In fact, he inherited the title from his grandparents of Most Catholic King. Good international relationships to form a marriage with. What did Christina think? She turned him down flatly. Remember, he had a very bad record with his wives. The first one he had put aside, annulled or divorced, and the second one he had executed, and the third one had died in childbirth. Well, that's a common thing. But I've heard two statements that she was supposed to have made when she rejected Henry. She said, "If I had but 2 heads, I would gladly put one at the disposal of the King of England." Yeah, I think she's telling you exactly why she will not marry him. And then she's supposed to have said, "I have but a little neck. I can't stand up to the headsman's axe or the executioner's sword." So some of the prime candidates as potential brides were not that interested in marrying Henry, which is quite a reversal. When he was a young man, he was considered to be the catch of all the princes. I mean, he was the handsomest, he was athletic, he wrote music and poetry and was, educated, and, he was just, he's Prince Charming. But character will out. And what they always say, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Henry VIII is certainly an example of that. In fact, I think I'll tell you my favorite little Henry VIII's character in a capsule. I like Maxwell Anderson's verse plays. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of those. And I was very interested in the Tudors. And there was I'm paraphrasing, I'm doing this from decades ago memory, but there was a line in Anne of a Thousand Days, a play by Maxwell Anderson about Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. It was made into a movie with Jacqueline Bisset as Anne Boleyn and Richard Burton as Henry. But anyway, in this, he says something like, "Every day I pray that I will do God's will. And because I know that God answers prayers, everything I do is God's will." And, that's actually probably how he thought. Martin Luther has said that Squire Henry, sort of putting him down with the title, wants to be God and do as he pleases. And yeah, that's it. He thought he should be the head of the church. He should be the head of the country. Everybody should do what he wants. And pretty much how he lived his life. So, where did he find a bride? Well, the Germanic court of Cleves, near the Netherlands, where the Netherlands and Germany meet. The Duke of Cleves had a sister, and the Duke of Cleves was Protestant, and the Protestant faction at the court wanted to have an alliance made with a Protestant princess to have allies against the Catholic forces, which were quite strong. And so, Holbein was sent to paint this portrait of Anne of Cleves. And it was totally a political marriage. Now, the court at Cleves was evidently much more conservative in the way women were raised. Anne Boleyn had actually been a lady-in-waiting at the French court, and she had to learn French manners and dancing and flirting and, this kind of behavior that attracted a man. But not Anne of Cleves. She was much more staid. She did not have the, she didn't play, essentially. She didn't know how to do all these things that some of Henry's other wives had. And it got off to a very bad start. He actually showed up with a lot of other men, masked, and she didn't know he was the king, and she didn't get the fact that he was supposed to be playful and chivalrous and whatever. It was just a disaster. He did not like her appearance. When you look at the portrait, you say, well, she certainly is as beautiful as Jane Seymour, maybe more so. Why does he have such an objection? And the portrait was, shows her as a reasonably attractive young woman. But when he sees her, I gather she was large boned or something, and he calls her the Flemish Meyer. And he's horrified. He doesn't want to go through with the marriage. He doesn't like her, whatever. But they say, you've got to go through with the marriage. That's treaties are involved. And so he does marry her, but he doesn't want to stay married. And he claims that the marriage was not consummated. Most people think it probably was, but and he comes with a divorce decree, and asks Anne to sign off on it. Anne is no dummy. She really probably doesn't want to remain. She probably, I'm just going to guess here, might have been as repulsed by him and his physical appearance as she, because by this time he was quite fat, as he was by hers. And so he comes and says, we want to get a divorce. And she agrees to get a divorce. And then she is given castle. She's given, wealth. She's given things to maintain herself, and she's given the title of the sister of the king, the sister of the king. And she goes on and has reputedly a, peaceful, happy life in England, away from the restrictions that her brother might have put on her, or maybe he would have tried to marry her off to somebody else. And she has a certain amount of autonomy. So that divorce worked out well for both parties, evidently. And you can see, once again, the things we've said before about Holbein's portraits. You have this smooth and attractive face looking out from the elaborate headdress. with all of the jewels and the transparent garments and the brocades. And of course, this, I think Tudor clothing is just beautiful. There's wonderful shapes of the velvet dress. And then, of course, once again, we say that the background, this dark green, is really interesting negative shapes as well as positive shapes. So you could look at this as, three-dimensional figure, but you could also look at it as flat pattern. You can see it either way. Yeah. Henry liked her picture, but not her person, and called her the Flemish Meyer. She agreed to the divorce, and she remained in England as the sister to the queen, sister to the king, as they called her. There are some of the details. Once again, lots of wonderful details showing the clothing here and the jewelry. Very elaborate clothing that they wore. This is in the National Gallery in Washington, and I think it's a wonderful picture of a child. He's only 2 years old, but he's shown as a little prince. Which is what he is. This was what Holbein gave to Henry VIII as his New Year's Day present in 1540, when Edward was 2 years old. We usually give gifts on Christmas. The gift exchange was on New Year's in the English court at this time, and artists sometimes would create artwork that they would give as gifts to the monarch. The inscription, and you can see that maybe he's 2 years old, but he's dressed like an adult, although he has a little rattle. His gesture is, like I said, it's like an adult. He's shown as the future king rather than a little baby. In his looks, he's a child, but he's all got the presence of a monarch. And the inscription is very flattering to Henry. It says, "Little one, imitate your father and be the heir of his virtue. The world contains nothing greater." Well, that's certainly what Henry believed about himself, and there it is. Now, we said that Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church to get his annulment, his divorce, get rid of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. And that break, Henry didn't immediately take up with all the Protestant ideas. He just wanted to be in control. He wanted to be the head of the church and do what he wanted. Squire Henry wants to be God and do as he pleases. It's probably a fairly accurate assessment. But there were proponents of the new religion in the court. And some of them were... Well, the marriages often had this, this political clout of whichever party and whatever things you wanted to have done. So Anne Boleyn was of the Protestant party. Jane Seymour was of the Protestant party. In fact, her brothers later go on. Her brother Edward later goes on to be the regent, while Edward is still a child. He dies as a teenager, but a child king. And then then he married. After he got rid of Anne, he married Catherine Howard. This was a bad mistake. Catherine Howard's a very young girl, and I always think of her as kind of like a valley girl. She had not the slightest idea of what she was getting into, and she couldn't have said no anyway. She did have lovers, and like I said, she was very, very young. She had this fat old man with smelly sword on his leg as her husband, and she had affairs. And they ended up executing not only her and her lovers, but even people who had had affairs with her before she was married. They didn't know she was going to be the queen someday. And Catherine Howard was also executed. She, incidentally, was a cousin of Anne Boleyn's. And then his final wife was Catherine Parr, who was a widow and probably would have been, was a pretty good person for his wife in old age. She knew what was what. She also was quite intellectual and very much allied with the Protestants. And there were times that when the other side tried to get her executed, and she was very smart. She was able to run to Henry and, come weeping to him and say, "If I have offended you, I'm just a poor weak woman, and just teach me, what the true faith, whatever you want right now." And when the people showed up with the death decree, he just threw them out and was very angry that they would come and try to take this humble woman who was his wife, even though he had signed the decree. So she survived Henry. She then married Jane Seymour's other brother, Thomas, who was the Lord Admiral, and she died in childbirth with his daughter. So that's the story of the wives of Henry VIII. But when he broke with the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, it didn't mean that he immediately adopted all things Protestant. I mean, even with, as you can see, even with his last and final wife, she was too Protestant for him. If he had completely known the scope, I guess, of her beliefs. But there was this great push, and one of the things that did happen was that an authorized English translation of the Bible was made, and that's the Coverdale Bible of 1535. In 1534, the Canterbury Convocation petitioned the king for an English Bible translation. And it was printed, this is the printer's name, as Coverdale, by Miles Coverdale in 1535. And the illustration of this cover page was designed by Hans Holbein. To me, there's also something quite sad about this, because the Coverdale Bible was in great part based on the Tyndale Bible. And Tyndale was executed for daring to translate the Bible into English. And only, not very many years later, it comes out officially sanctioned by the king in translation. And as I say, in the 16th century, it was a dangerous time. I sometimes say, like, one week if you said that it was not the true body of Christ in the sacrament, you could be burnt at the stake for heresy. And the next week, if you said it was, you were in trouble equally, because as the king changed his mind, the doctrines and the practices changed. So by 1535, he was willing to have an English Bible. It's based on the Tyndale Bible. It's also based on German, translated from English from the German Bibles by Luther and Zwingli for the books that Tyndale had not yet translated when he was executed. The Bible was dedicated to King Henry VIII, very smart move, and it was printed not in England but on the continent, the European continent, and they're not quite sure where, either Cologne or Antwerp. Now, title page by Hans Holbein the Younger. And that idea that we've seen already, the contrast between law and grace, is shown here as well. But some of the things you find in Chronic, and some things are original to this. So let's look at some of the details. At the bottom, we see King Henry VIII here in his kingly regalia, holding a scepter, or a sword perhaps, I think, scepter, a crown, ermine, on his throne as he gives the Bible to the bishops. Now, his authority is behind it. And on either side you have David, King David, of course, playing the harp. He wasn't, and the presumptive author of the Psalms. And on the other side, I believe it is, yes, it is, it's St. Paul. You can see some of the other images, this contrast between law and grace. You have up at the upper left the original sin of Adam and Eve, contrasted with the resurrection of Christ, and he's treading on the devil and death. In other words, Christ is victorious over sin and death. Adam and Eve brought sin and death into the world, but Christ is victorious over it. Down below, you have Moses receiving the law, the Ten Commandments, and Christ, giving a new commandment to his apostles. And once again, you see the Old Testament contrasted with the New Testament scenes on the side. And this isn't in your textbook, but I thought it was kind of interesting to show you this, because even great artists, as you've seen, sometimes copy from other artists at this time. And of course, you might have a commission that asked for it. This is obviously based on Lucas Chronic's Law and the Gospel, or Law and Grace, or Allegory of the Old and New Testament. But it's by Hans Holbein. And I think you can also see that Holbein technically is probably a better artist. His anatomy is better. His spatial relationships are stronger. But he's using the same format as Lucas Chronic did in his Prague version of the Law and the Gospels, or Law and Grace. And I noticed that the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, which has the Holbein painting on their website, they do call it Law and Grace, in part because at the very top, I think you can make this out, but above Moses, it says Lex, or law, and above a scene of the Incarnation, which we'll take a look at shortly, it says Gratia, grace. So those words are literally in the Holbein picture. And in fact, if you had any doubts about who the different people are, Holbein labels everybody. So it gives you a very clear picture. Man, homo, is shown between Isaiah and John the Baptist, and everybody's clearly labeled. If you wonder which prophet it was, it says Isaiah. Of course, John the Baptist is easily recognizable. And they're both exhorting every man, humanity, to follow Christ, to have faith in Christ, as they point toward the crucified Christ, or the resurrected Christ, and the right side, as we look at it, part of the painting. And I think that is interesting, because in most paintings, say a Last Judgment, what we would say, the bad side is the left side and the good side is the right side, and it's by the image of Christ or the figures in the painting, whether it's right or left. But this one, it's from the viewer's point of view. So it's clearly that this is something the viewer is supposed to be reacting to. Here we have the contrast, and I think Holbein does that very, very well, where he has this clear contrast of the scene on each side. You have, it says, peccatum, sin, for the original sin, the fall of man, and then something that is not in the Holbein is Christ with his followers, with his apostles, and then it says Agnus Dei above it. So rather than just showing the image of the Agnus Dei, which is what Holbein does, which is what Chronic does, Holbein just portrays Christ and calls him the Agnus Dei. And as you can see, John the Baptist is pointing right at him. And it's John the Baptist is the one who called Christ the Lamb of God. And then you see in the foreground the resurrected Christ stepping out of the open tomb, treading on the death and the devil. A little pop-eyed devil there. Once again, very clearly written, Victoria Nostra, our victory over sin and death. And it was Christ's victory, but because of this, is all humanity's victory, because no longer are they subject to sin and death if they have, as they believed, have faith in Christ. That, of course, is contrasted with an image of death in a kind of broken sarcophagus that we can see, and this just skeleton there just says death. I mean, that's what, if you don't have Christ, that's what you've got. You just die. So we see the original sin brings death into the world, shown by the skeleton. And so you have both the association with the conquest of death on the other side with Christ, and also the association with Adam and Eve, who brought death into the world. So it's a very, very clearly arranged. At the very top, you have two sort of mountaintop images. One, of course, took place on Mount Sinai. You have Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, and you hear the hand of God is sort of passing them down, completely written, and it says lex, which means law. He was receiving the law. And then you have a scene of the incarnation. Now, there's no reason to have Mary on a mountaintop, essentially, except to balance the image of Moses on the other side. This is where the era under grace begins. The era under law ends and the era under grace begins. So you have the Virgin Mary, kneeling with her hands clasped, and the little baby Jesus carrying the cross. He's going to be the Savior. He knows it already. Coming down to her. So essentially, they're showing an image of the incarnation, without the angel Gabriel. Although we do have these clouds that seem to be taking on little heads, perhaps, of angels behind her, possibly. And once again, we have the brazen serpent, only here very, very clearly paralleled to the cross of Christ. So one says the mystery of justification, and on the other hand, the cross of Christ, it is our justification. We are justified our sins have been forgiven, essentially. And you also still see the adoration of the shepherds, which heralds the incarnation. The annunciation to the shepherds. So, what does it mean? It means that if you follow the law, this will only lead to death. You can't be good enough. But that man is redeemed by the grace of Jesus. And, I do think it's really interesting how he has, in many ways, copied Lucas Chronic, but also transformed the Chronic image, both by more skillful use of anatomy and space and things like that, but also the arrangement, so that the parallels are absolutely clear and the labels make everything absolutely clear.